Hey, hello. I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you please turn on the sound for the Zoom because we are not being able to hear.
Is this the right one to
Thanks.
mute?
Uh-oh.
I just unmuted there.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
that's,
now it's working. Thanks.
yep, okay. That is my apologies. Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Can the Zoom folks hear now?
All clear.
All right. Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. If you've been reading the slides, you'll catch up. All right. All right. So one alternative to this family of views is sometimes referred to as non-evident. Oh, now I've lost my mouse. Let's see. No, it's okay. It's a solvable problem. There we go now. No. Maybe you need to go back to this sharing screen.
That should do it. There you go.
Excellent. And one kind of flavor of these views is what's called non-evidentialism. And the idea here is that belief should take more than evidence into account. So for example, you might have a situation where you have a moral reason to believe something, and that could potentially outweigh evidential kinds of considerations. And in thinking about this, I think it's worth having factual claims in mind as your paradigmatic cases where this debate arises, right? So these are propositions like, whether or not insects feel pain, whether or not God exists, whether or not humans are causing climate change, and so on. And so the thought is that for these kinds of propositions, if you have a moral reason to believe something, that might potentially outweigh one. And one case where you might find this somewhat plausible, if that doesn't sound very plausible, if you imagine a situation where an extremely close friend is accused of a crime, and there's some evidence that suggests that they are guilty, but you might feel that loyalty to your friend sort of demands that you give them the benefit of the doubt, or that you maybe have a moral obligation to think of them as innocent, not just because you've known them longer and have strong prior beliefs or something like that, or more evidence, but just by virtue of your moral relationship. And so the toy version of this would look like this, right? Where you might imagine two people who both have the same evidence about whether or not someone's guilty of a crime, but one of them additionally has this moral reason to believe their friend is innocent by virtue of this loyalty or moral obligation to the friend. And so a non-evidentialist has the resources to say that perhaps these people ought to believe different things, even though their evidence is the same. And a third position, sometimes referred to as moral encroachment, is that beliefs ought to strictly be a function of evidence, but you might think you have different thresholds for evidence in different circumstances, right? So you might think that what it means to give a friend the benefit of the doubt isn't to base your belief on something other than evidence, but rather to have a different threshold for how much evidence you need before you're willing to believe that the friend is guilty. And so one way to characterize this is this toy image over here. So you might have these two people, exact same evidence, but maybe they have different functions that they can apply over that evidence that specify different thresholds for belief. All right, so part of the reason I go through this is to give you sort of a sketch of possible ways that you might think moral considerations should or shouldn't influence belief. And of course, these are overwhelmingly meant to be normative claims about how we ought to regulate our beliefs, but there's a corresponding set of empirical questions about what people in fact do, right? How people in fact think beliefs ought to be formed. And by and large, I would say that the psychology evidence has suggested that at least weird people are intuitive evidentialists, right? So overwhelmingly, this evidence comes from participants in the United States. And there's lots of different pockets of evidence, but a lot of it suggests that people think about their own belief formation as being based on evidence. And so this is just one of many pieces of data I could pull out here, but it comes from some studies looking at individual variation in these kinds of beliefs. And you find that quite a lot of people agree strongly with claims like, it's important to me personally that I can justify my beliefs using rational arguments and evidence, and so on. There is variation, but this is a very, very common view. So there's an observation that's potentially puzzling in light of this, which is that we know that in fact, people believe all sorts of things that are almost certainly based on insufficient evidence. And so this raises a puzzle, right? Well, how is it that on the one hand, people take themselves to have these particular norms for belief that are grounded on evidence, and on the other hand, we have all of this evidence that their beliefs are in fact not governed by these kinds of considerations. And there's a standard story that we get largely from social psychology, but I'd say psychology in general. And the standard story to make sense of this looks like this. At an unconscious level, our beliefs are influenced by like all sorts of things, They're influenced by preferences and values and desires and wishful thinking and so on, and all of the things that go under the kind of heading of motivated reasoning. And we have decades of research giving us really compelling evidence that all sorts of things, in fact, influence belief. But at the conscious level, people have this sort of intuitive theory of how their belief formation works. And at the conscious level, they basically take themselves to have based their views on evidence. And this is sometimes referred to as the illusion of objectivity or objectivity bias, blind spot, naive realism. There's this cluster of ideas that even while we might recognize these kinds of motivational influences in other people's belief formation, possibly even in our own past belief formation, we take ourselves currently to be reasoning objectively, rationally on the basis of the evidence. We are seeing things as they really are. And so let me just give you a flavor of the sorts of things people have said in this literature. So for example, here's Kruglansky telling us that people think the only legitimate reasons for adopting a given conclusion as true are informational, or based on something like evidence. That beliefs based on perceived value versus evidence would threaten an individual's conception of themselves as a reasonable, rational individual. That people aim to believe such that they could persuade a dispassionate observer, and they form beliefs only if they can muster up the evidence necessary to support them. And in fact, this is sometimes thought to be a sort of constraint or guardrail on motivated reasoning, right? We can't just will ourselves into believing whatever we want. There's certain kinds of constraints, and this might be one of them. So on this, I think, relatively common picture, there's two predictions that follow. So one is that people should endorse exclusively evidential reasons for belief, right? If you ask people to consciously reflect on why they believe what they do, you should overwhelmingly get these kinds of evidential or informational kinds of considerations. And that insofar as other influences on belief make it into conscious awareness, people should revise their belief or reject that as having had an influence on their belief, or perhaps launder it as evidence, right? So if they find themselves strongly believing something, the story they're going to tell about why they strongly believe it is going to be, well, I have a lot of evidence for that belief, even if in fact there were other influences that played a role. Okay, so I take this to be a pretty standard story, and I think it's actually well supported in lots of cases by lots of evidence. But I want to argue against this, at least in particular cases. And the kinds of cases I'm going to focus on are cases where people think they have a good moral reason to believe something. And I want to suggest that in some of these cases, people are actually consciously aware of their moral reasons, and they think they are reasoning as they should by virtue of taking these moral considerations into account. All right, so here's my plan for today. I'm going to first give you some evidence that people explicitly endorse a variety of reasons for belief, including moral reasons for belief, at least in some conditions. That an individual's moral reasons for belief aren't always laundered as evidence, in the sense that they do not always report having evidence that sort of factors in those moral considerations. When we get to that, it'll hopefully be a little bit clear what the logic is. I'm going to give you some evidence that these moral reasons aren't just correlated with belief, but in fact have a causal impact on belief. And finally, that individuals in some circumstances recognize and endorse the role of moral reasons in their own belief formation. Okay, so that's the plan. Before I launch into the data, I just want to say something about why I think this matters. From my perspective, there are actually real open normative questions about whether and when moral considerations should influence belief. But I think that if we can get some grip on the right normative story, we're invariably going to discover that there are certain aspects of the way we tend to form beliefs or the particular beliefs we have that we might want to consider erroneous. And in that case, if you want to think about how we could have better beliefs or better belief formation systems, it's going to turn out, I think, to be very important to know what the interplay is between these conscious and unconscious sorts of mechanisms, right? So in particular, if you show someone evidence that they were sort of morally biased in their belief formation, but they know that already and they don't take it to be an error, right? That's not going to be a motivation to change their view. And the flip side is true as well. Suppose we ought to be taking moral considerations into account in some way, and you show someone evidence that they're failing to do so. If they think they shouldn't be doing so, that's the right way to form beliefs, that's not going to be a motivation to change, right? So I think that if we want to be the best believers and thinkers and reasoners that we can be, whatever that means, it's going to be important to understand what some of these mechanisms are. All right, so now I get to launch into the data. First piece of data I'm going to show you is pretty straightforward. And this is just showing you that people will explicitly endorse moral reasons for belief, at least sometimes. So what we did here is that we adapted a task that had been used previously as an individual difference measure. And we asked people to what extent they considered various justifications that someone might use for accepting a claim or statement as true. And we asked them to tell us how good those justifications were. And they just gave us a rating from very poor reason to believe to excellent reason to believe. And what we varied was whether or not we didn't say anything about the domain in question, or whether we gave them told them it was scientific or religious. And the reasons that they evaluated were these. They fell into 6 categories. I'm just showing you 2 from each of these categories. In some cases, there were a few more. We were interested in explicitly scientific or religious reasons. So for example, there's good scientific evidence for it, or it's an article of faith in my religion. But we were also interested in these other categories of reasons that people might explicitly acknowledge as an influence on their beliefs. So affiliative considerations, like the people I love believe it's true. Moral considerations, like believing it encourages people to be good, accepting it is the moral thing to do. What we called intuitive considerations, like it feels true in my gut or my heart tells me it's true, and explanatory considerations, like it explains a lot of things really well. And so participants were just explicitly telling us to what extent they consider these to be good reasons for belief. All right, so in the baseline case where we don't specify the domain of the belief at all, we just tell people to tell us what a good reason for belief is, here's what we get. And I should say this is this initial study was a mechanical Turk sample. So this is a fairly secular sample here. And you can see people really like the scientific reasons. The explanatory ones and the moral ones are okay. The other ones are less good. So they're definitely, we're not getting enormous endorsement of the moral reasons, but you can see that it is accepted some of the time by some people. When we explicitly tell them to consider science, we get something that's virtually identical, which suggests that whatever this population is doing in the unspecified case is very similar to the scientific case. The only significant difference is that when something is scientific, they're less likely to give these affiliative kinds of reasons. Yeah.
Question. The scale. So saying it's a poor reason is endorsing it to some level?
So this is really made up of, as you can imagine, a distribution around here, right? And so what this reflects is some people giving 3s and 4s, right? And they're doing that more than these, right? So yeah, they don't like these very much. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's more meaningful really is the comparative claims here, right? That moral is higher than, for example, affiliative and intuitive. It's definitely, I mean, it's much lower than scientific. They really like scientific. And the other comparative claim that's relevant is what happens when you say religious. Yeah.
The scale is 1 to 4.
For this one, yes. Yeah. Yes.
What the question is, select all.
That's right. So for this particular task, they see all of these. It's a 4-point rating scale. They could have given them all 4s. We don't do anything to constrain the relationships between those ratings. Yeah, and what you can see is that when you say it's a religious claim, now actually the science and religion cases in particular are different for all of these except the explanatory considerations, which interestingly are pretty consistent across these cases. And so I think some of these are very unsurprising, right? So for example, I think it's not at all surprising that people appeal to think scientific evidence is better for scientific claims than for religious claims. And they think religious considerations are better reasons for belief for religious claims than scientific claims. I think the interesting stuff is over here, where we're seeing that people are appealing to the affiliative, moral, and intuitive kinds of considerations more often for religion than for science. Although with the important caveat, it's not that they're really liking these enormously, right? But they're better. This is just to show you that we replicated this. Here the scale is different. Here they had to just check which ones they thought were good reasons for belief. And so this is proportion of participants checking it. But here we had them identify a particular scientific belief and a particular religious belief with which they themselves strongly agreed. And so we matched the confidence in those beliefs. And so this is only showing participants who in fact all endorsed some scientific claim and some religious claim strongly. And for those participants, we still see the same kinds of patterns of difference in terms of what they're looking for belief. Okay, so the only point I want to make with this study, which I should say, I've picked this data out of a broader set of studies about this, but the only point I want to make here is that people will explicitly endorse, at least some of the time, reasons for belief that include moral reasons for belief. This study on its own doesn't tell you whether or not they take the moral reasons to be evidential though, right? I mean, for example, if you believe that the world is just a morally good place, then you might think that beliefs that have positive moral consequences are just in fact more likely to be true, right? So it's possible that all of these reasons are being sort of understood as offering evidence for truth, as opposed to being independent, non-evidential reasons for belief. I mean, I think it's especially plausible for something like these intuitive reasons for belief. You could think that what you feel in your gut is just like good evidence about what's true. Or you could think that what your loved ones believe is sort of good on epistemic grounds, and it's good evidence for belief. So in the second study, we're going to explicitly measure people's perceptions of how much evidence they have that something is true, and then see if once we've taken that into account, the moral value they associate with a belief plays any role in predicting whether or not they claim to believe it. Okay, so here's what this looks like. We got a whole bunch of different beliefs. This is a subset of, I think there were about 20 across 2 studies. But what we wanted was a range of beliefs that we thought would plausibly vary in the evidence people think they have for it, in the perceived pragmatic value of the beliefs, and the perceived moral value of the beliefs. And so we wanted variation across statements and across people. A few of them are religious, but actually most of them are not. And what we did is we asked people this belief endorsement question. So they had the option to select one of 3 things. Either I believe that blank. So for example, I believe that God exists, or I believe that people have free will. I believe that God doesn't exist, or I believe that people don't have free will, or I'm undecided about whether or not this proposition is the case, right? So they had those 3 choices, and we're going to consider the people who chose the first one, saying that they believe the proposition, as the ones who believe it. And the question is, can we predict who falls into the belief category from their perceptions of how much evidence they have for the claim and the extent to which they ascribe moral value to that belief? So hopefully the logic makes sense. And then the huge challenge with all of these studies is like, how do you measure perceptions of evidence? And we worried a lot about this. And so I'm going to show you 2 different ways that we did it here. In other studies, we've done different things. And so the way we're going to ask our question is, once you've taken into account the perceived evidence that people have, does the perceived moral value of the belief have any additional predictive power in whether or not they're going to endorse the belief? Okay, so that's the logic of it. Okay, so across studies, we had 2 studies, and we measured evidence in 2 different ways across these, just because any given way of measuring evidence caused some worries for us. So in this case, we sort of took this idea that comes from the motivated reasoning literature, that you really ought to, that you're going to hold yourself to the standard that you're going to only form beliefs if you could justify them to another person. And so here's the kind of thought experiment that we set up. So you have to imagine that you're speaking with someone who's 100% perfectly open-minded. They're willing to carefully listen to you and trust you, and you have as much time as you want to share all of the evidence that you have and arguments in favor and against believing that whatever that proposition is, say that God exists. This person will form a belief based on what you provided them. However, this person is also perfectly objective, logical, and rational, and will only form a belief that they consider to be perfectly justified. So based on the evidence you can provide to this person, what would they estimate is the probability that this proposition is true? All right, and they gave us a number between 0 and 100%. All right, so that was one way we measured evidence. One concern we had about this is that people might think they have private evidence, right? Like evidence that's compelling for them, but that they can't share with somebody else. So for example, if you take yourself to have had a particular experience, that's part of your reason for believing something, you might consider that to be evidence, even though I can't then tell Edouard and have him find it to be evidence in the same way. And so we did another version of this where we explicitly say what we consider to be evidence. We're interested in how much evidence you have for these claims, and we give them lots of examples of what counts as evidence. So for example, if somebody you trust tells you something, if you read it in a scientific study or an article that you think is trustworthy, if you have an experience. So we can sort of give them like a broad conception of what counts as evidence. And now we've removed the other person in this. We just have them reflect on how much evidence and arguments they think they have for and against the proposition. And then say, overall, when I think about things rationally and objectively, the evidence and arguments that I have suggest that it is, and they give us a 7-point rating for how likely they think it is to be true. Okay. So again, I think all of these have pros and cons, right? But hopefully if we find consistent evidence against these consistent findings, don't want to repeat evidence too much, well, we can be more confident that we're sort of tracking something about people's perceptions of evidence. Okay, we also had to measure moral value. So again, we did this in a couple different ways. But for example, one way we did it was to ask people, even if it weren't true, believing, say, that God exists would make me a better friend and family member. Oh, it's not up there. Sorry. What I see here is strangely does not include the animations. So now you see it. Okay. So even if it weren't true, believing that God exists would make me a better friend and family member, or even if it weren't true, it would make me a more useful and helpful person to society to believe that God exists. And they would give us an agreement rating here. We measured this a slightly different way in the other experiment, but similar idea. We also asked them about the pragmatic value. And so the way we were conceptualizing this is that these up here are really kind of community or other serving kinds of roles for belief. And these are sort of more self-serving. So for example, life would be easier for me if I believed it, or people would like me more if I believed it, and so on. And this is largely for comparison to the moral cases. Okay, so here is one of our key sets of findings. Okay, so this is for studies 1A and B. They just differed in which beliefs we use and which measure of evidence and which measure of moral value. Along the x-axis is people's perceptions of evidence in one of these two ways that we elicited it. Over here, they think their evidence favors the opposing belief. Here it favors the belief itself. On the y-axis is the percentage of participants who endorse the belief. They say I believe that proposition for the corresponding levels of evidence. And then this is split up by basically a median split here, whether it's high or low moral value. I should say our statistical analyses took moral value to be continuous, but here I'm just visualizing it for you by splitting it up. Okay, so what's the first thing to notice? The first thing to notice is huge effective evidence, right? Whether or not people are willing to say that they believe something tracks their perceived evidence really, really closely. We have this incredibly strong positive relationship. But on top of that, there's this effect of perceived moral value. And one way to sort of characterize what's going on here is that, for example, if you take yourself to have evidence at the say like 50-50 point, if the belief is not perceived to be morally valuable, that's only enough for like 20% of people to say that they believe it. But if it's perceived to be morally valuable, it's enough for like 50% of people to say that they believe it. Here's another way to visualize the data. So now what I've done is I've put perceived moral value on the x-axis, and here it's collapsing across these two studies. Again, proportion of participants who believe something on the y-axis. And now things are split up by whether or not the evidence on balance, according to this participant, favored the opposing belief or favored the belief. Okay, so first thing to notice again, huge effective evidence, right? So when people think the evidence on balance favors the belief, they're like endorsing it almost all the time, almost at ceiling up here. But then you see this interesting thing in those cases where people think that on balance, the evidence supports the opposing belief, which is that when those candidate propositions are perceived to have high moral value, you nonetheless see this effect where people are sometimes willing to endorse them, right? So here we have about, I don't know what that is, like 30-some% of participants endorsing these beliefs that they themselves say are not only like not supported by the evidence, is that the evidence more strongly favors the falsity of that claim, and yet they are nonetheless saying that they believe it, and that's predicted by the extent to which they think it's morally valuable. So if we go back to these sort of toy characterizations of different kinds of views that you could have, I think this finding here, I think is pretty hard to reconcile with a moral encroachment view, because these participants are saying that the evidence on balance favors the other view, right? So if you were thinking you're just sort of changing thresholds, you have to do something a little bit strange with the way that you count strength of evidence to have a view like this account for these results. So I think these results at least are much more naturally accounted for by a view like this, where people think that moral considerations are themselves sort of genuinely part of what you put into the calculus of figuring out what to believe. I should say most of our other results I think could be explained either way, but I think this one's a challenge for the encroachment view. Okay, this is what it looks like for the pragmatic cases rather than the moral cases, right? So now along the x-axis, instead of showing you perceived moral value of the belief, I'm showing you the pragmatic value. And the key thing to see here is that you do not see the same sort of like special increase down here, which suggests that people are not indiscriminately thinking that anything that makes a belief good along some dimension is going to make it a good candidate for belief. It seems like they're being more discriminating than that. There's something special about the moral cases. In the context of GPP, I wanted to show you this slide as well. So just in our first study, we also had people tell us whether they endorsed the claim that they know that the proposition holds. So for example, I know that God exists. And so here again, they had these three choices. I know that God exists, I know that God doesn't exist, or I have no knowledge about whether or not God exists or not. Steve, you're very unhappy.
I would have thought that was the only third alternative.
Maybe it was, did we say no? I have no knowledge. I think that might be, in other cases, we've said undecided. I think for knowledge, we felt like you have knowledge, you don't have knowledge, sorry, you have knowledge that P or that not P, or you don't have knowledge. Anyway, that's how we asked it. We can talk about it later. I doubt that had a big impact on these results. I mean, the key thing to show you here is, again, we have the moral cases and the pragmatic cases. Compared to the belief cases, we're getting lower overall levels of endorsement, right? So people are a little less inclined to say that they know something than that they believe something. But again, we see this influence of the most morally valuable beliefs leading to an increase in people's endorsement. Okay. So I take this to be evidence that an individual's moral reasons for belief aren't always laundered as evidence in the specific sense that they can have an impact on belief formation that isn't laundered as evidence, right? People are not taking these moral reasons for belief to constitute evidence such that when we try to assess the evidence, it's already built into that assessment. Okay, so that study though is all correlational, right? And so what we aim to do in this next study is provide some evidence for a causal relationship. Okay, so in order to do this, what we needed was a morally and evidentially ambiguous proposition. We wanted something to be evidentially ambiguous so that we could potentially move it around with an experimental manipulation. And we wanted it to be morally ambiguous so that we could potentially supply people with moral reasons to believe or not believe, and again, have that impact their beliefs. And so Corey, my collaborator on this, came up with what I think is a brilliant case for studying this question. And this comes to some extent out of the philosophy literature where cases like this have been discussed. So take something like a race-based generalization, like the following, that Black people in the United States on average tip less than white people. We would expect our participants to consider this evidentially ambiguous. We don't expect them to have strong prior knowledge about this, and therefore to come into the study thinking it's unambiguous. Now, in fact, there's quite a large literature in consumer behavior that has studied tipping behavior. So this is not, in fact, that evidentially ambiguous. There's a lot of data. But from the perspective of our participants, we expect this to be something that they have sort of like weak priors about. And therefore, we can potentially move around what they believe. It's also the sort of claim that's actively debated in normative epistemology. So if you look at the literature in the ethics of belief, you can find arguments for why these kinds of claims are potentially problematic, and also arguments for why they're actually important to be able to make it not problematic. And so the thought is that potentially we can push around whether or not people are willing to endorse a claim like this by giving them moral reasons that are evidentially irrelevant to the truth of the claim. Okay, so that's what we're going for. So here's how we did it. We first told participants about an actual review paper that goes through this research on consumer behavior, analyzing tipping behavior. And the conclusion of this paper is that Black people in the United States on average tip less than white people during the period when this was measured. And we asked people whether or not they accept the conclusions of the paper. And so they could say, yes, I accept that conclusion. No, I don't believe that conclusion. Or I'm currently withholding belief on this issue until I gain more information. And so here, just when we gave them this information, here's what participants did. 44% endorsed the claim, and so we're going to call them believers. And then we had the non-believers down here. I mean, you can see the most common position, which I think is a very sensible thing for participants to have done, is to choose this last category here. But a sizable number do accept the results. All right, now we want to give them arguments about the moral value of this belief. And basically, we took arguments from the philosophy literature and turned them into 3 paragraphs that we thought would be digestible by our participants. And so roughly what that looked like is we tell everybody that philosophers have wondered whether it's morally acceptable to form beliefs about others on the basis of race and so on. And so in one case, they got these 2 arguments for why that might be morally problematic. One has to do with the idea that these beliefs can set a dangerous precedent in our minds by leading us to think that these are really meaningful categories, potentially essentializing them and so on. The other argument was that there's something disrespectful about assuming individuals are going to have particular characteristics on the basis of their group. And so part of sort of treating people with due respect is treating them as individuals in a way that makes this problematic. On the other side, there were arguments that it's important to separate beliefs from actions, right? So even if you believe something like this is true, that doesn't have implications for how you're going to act or treat people. And moreover, if you really care about addressing inequalities, it's really important to be able to make these race-based generalizations in order to identify areas of intervention and so on. Okay, so participants got these arguments. And now we're curious about whether or not this will shift their beliefs. If it does shift their beliefs, it's important to establish that it's not because they take this to be evidentially relevant. And so we did what I thought was probably a ridiculous experiment from the perspective of participants, but we sort of needed to do it to make the claim. We had other participants just get these arguments and we asked them, is there anything in this argument that gives you evidence one way or the other about whether or not Black people on average tip less than white people? And they say no, right? Okay, so here's what we find. So we have participants give us this belief measure before the argument, after the argument. We also ask the extent to which they think the belief is justified. And what you can see is that we get movement in the expected directions based on the kind of argument they received, where those who received the bad argument then go on sometimes to sort of withhold belief, even though they'd originally said they believed the conclusion, and the reverse in the other case where they have the good argument, with similar effects for justification. Here we only get this downward trend for the morally bad argument, right? So these are not enormous effects, right? But we are pushing around whether or not people report that they believe these claims based on these moral considerations about the belief. One concern that we had and that you may have is, to what extent are people doing this just because, you know, I'm in an experiment and the experimenter gave me an argument that this is good or bad. Maybe I should respond differently, or maybe the experimenter expects me to respond differently. So it's a little bit reassuring that we also asked them how good they thought the arguments were, and that sort of moderates the effects in the way that you would expect, right? So if it was just the case that, like, well, the experimenter is telling me that this is bad somehow, therefore I'm gonna be more conservative in what I say I believe, we would expect it to be relatively insensitive to whether or not they actually found the arguments to be persuasive. But instead we find that to the extent people thought the arguments were good, they were more likely to be influenced by the argument that they received. All right, so a little bit of evidence that there might be causal relationships here, although overwhelmingly the rest of our data is correlational. Okay, I'm tempted to stop for questions, but any major, yeah.
It's just the obvious one. At any point in what the participants were told, was it mentioned that Black people have less money than white people, so of course they're going to tip less.
So the studies, as you can imagine, like the actual studies of consumer behavior, of course, take that into account, and they take into account other things as well. Like, for example, the quality of your dining experience. Like, if you received less good service, you tend to tip less well, and race, unfortunately, is relevant to the quality of service you receive in a lot of these studies, right? So the studies certainly take that into account, and participants got a sort of abbreviated summary that said, like, here's some of the factors that they considered. But I mean, I guess I'm wondering why you're asking, because this claim doesn't say anything about why. Are you just thinking that if that was the reason, that would change the moral valence of the claim?
If that were the reason, it would be a perfectly reasonable thing to believe.
Well, you might think it's perfectly reasonable to believe. I mean, this is just data, right? Like, you know, these studies there's a lot of data out there. They find this generalization.
We can discuss this.
Yeah, fair enough. But okay, yeah, all right. This comes up in the next study too. You know, it looks a little bit different there. Okay. Okay. So final piece of evidence is just that individuals recognize and endorse the moral reasons in their own belief formation, right? So in these cases, I've shown you that there are influences, but I haven't shown you that people explicitly recognize those influences and think that they should be influenced in the way that they are, at least as our data suggests. So that's what we're trying to show in the last study. It's a little bit complicated. I'll walk you through the key parts. I'll also say we've replicated it 2 more times with the same belief here, and another time with a different belief. But I'm just going to show you the basic paradigm and the key result. Okay, so another kind of amazing thing that Corey did is he found like a naturally occurring minimal pair. So these are 2 papers, real scientific papers in the literature, published within a couple of years of each other. They both look at tipping behavior in Houston in the 90s. They have similar sample sizes, virtually identical methods. They find overwhelmingly the same patterns of results with one key difference, which is that this one finds no racial differences in tipping, and this one finds racial differences in tipping. And so this gives us a sort of like perfect minimal pair where we can present participants with these studies without any deception. These are real scientific studies, and see how they evaluate them. Okay, so here's what the study looked like. In the first stage, people got one of these two studies, and either the results of the studies where they find out that they did or didn't find racial differences, or the goals of the study, where the goals were basically claims corresponding to answering the question that corresponds to the result, right? So if the result was racial differences, the goal was to find out whether or not there were effects of race on tipping and so on. The purpose of this is to induce motivated reasoning, and we only expect that to occur in one condition. So in the case where there are racial differences, they found racial differences in tipping behavior, and participants find out about that, we expect them in that condition only to be especially motivated to be skeptical of the results and to question the quality of the study. Okay, so far, this is just like, there's hundreds of studies on motivated reasoning. So far, this is nothing new going on here. We did want to measure motivated reasoning, right? To make sure that these moral considerations are actually having an impact on how people evaluate the study. And so we asked people questions to rate the quality of the study, like how adequate was the sample size? Do you think the methods were appropriate? We had several questions like that. And also whether or not they accept the results or hypothetically would accept the results in the case where they didn't receive the results. For both of these ratings, we found the expected interactions, namely an interaction between which study you were presented and whether or not you got the results, such that people were selectively critical in this condition here. Okay. We then asked them, what we're calling moral judgments here. We wanted to know, to what extent does this participant think that there is a moral concern with this kind of race-based generalization reporting a racial difference? And so the wording was, I used to have the wording on my slide. It was something like, to what extent do you agree that it's disrespectful to make inferences about somebody's tipping behavior based on, and then they had a bunch of things they evaluated, but one of them was their race/ethnicity. So people vary in the extent to which they think that there's something disrespectful about these kinds of race-based generalizations. And so if we succeeded in generating motivated reasoning here due to these kinds of moral concerns, then what we should expect is that in this condition where we did induce motivated reasoning, there should be a correlation between the extent to which people had that moral concern and the extent to which they thought the study was done poorly and didn't accept it. And in fact, that's what we find, right? So there's variation across the board in this moral judgment, but only in this case where we think motivated reasoning in fact occurred, do we find this correlation where the more you had this moral concern, the more you were you showed motivated skepticism towards the study. Yeah.
So why do you think that there was motivated reasoning only in the second one? Why can't we say that also in the first one, when people are saying that the methodology is good and like this is a good study, but we couldn't say that also was motivated reasoning, but in the other way, that they were like less skeptical than, let's say, the default or the show.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the thought is, it was still a kind of directional motivation.
Yeah, just
but
the other direction. To accept and not to endorse.
I'm trying to think if I have anything in the data to rule that out. I mean, in fact, the way we replicate this is with claims that have that sort of structure, where we measure the relevant moral concerns in both directions, and we do find the kind of symmetrical structure you'd expect. So I actually think that's totally possible and consistent with the story here. What I'm trying to think about is, do we have any evidence in this study that was going on? I think I have some weak evidence that it wasn't, that when I get to the data, I'll point out. Yeah. Okay, so oh, yes.
So the motivated reason, the evidence for motivated reasoning is like indirect insofar as it's like selective skepticism, right? It's not like you weren't measuring like affect or something.
No, but I mean, this is pretty, so far, everything I've told you is like pretty standard for a motivated reasoning paradigm. I mean, the details would of course vary, but.
Maybe this is not relevant, but I guess it just doesn't seem like selective skepticism about like, it seems like there's something that contradicts one of my deeply held beliefs. I should like assume there's something wrong with it or something, and think about it more. So I guess I mean, it's important. I guess.
Where you think the deeply held belief is that it's disrespectful to make race-based generalizations or something like that? What's the deeply held belief? So here's something we know that's relevant to this. We do elicit people's priors in independent studies and in these studies. So we ask them, like, what do you think is true about tipping behavior? Right? Do you think that there is no racial differences, that there are racial differences? So we know this population's priors for this. Their prior is that there's probably a small racial difference in tipping behavior such that Black people tip less than white people.
Okay.
So their priors are actually consistent with the claim that we think this moral concern would make you motivated to reject.
Okay.
So it at least rules out one version of what you're saying. There's another version of what you're saying where I think you're kind of painting a very reasonable picture of why you might think some form of non-evidentialism or moral encroachment is true. Namely that we do have certain kinds of moral commitments and we ought to evaluate claims with respect to those moral commitments. But I don't think it's that people come in with like a descriptive belief that this conflicts with, because in fact, their descriptive beliefs are more consistent with there being a race-based difference. And if you do any of our analyses, plugging in people's priors to see if that accounts for, like we find everything, even accounting for people's priors coming into the study. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. All right. So far that was all just creating the conditions for the questions that we actually want to test. Right. So far, this is not particularly new. Like there really is lots of research on motivated reasoning that does things differently, but has this kind of basic structure. Here's what we want to get to, where we wanted to get to. Now we want to measure people's metacognitive assessment of what just happened, right? And we want to know whether or not they recognize and endorse, condone their morally motivated reasoning. And so we do this with these questions here, which I'm going to show you in a moment, but here's what they're trying to do. We're going to basically ask people, do you think your moral judgment played a role in your evaluation of the study? And do you think the role it played is something that it ought to have done, or were you like making a mistake basically in being influenced by that? I should say we also do this with respect to sex-based differences rather than race-based differences. So throughout the whole study, everything that we ask about race, we ask about sex, which is mainly there as a control because the studies don't find and don't report anything related to sex. So if any of our results were driven by like individual differences in the extent to which people are just going to report that they have these kinds of concerns, and so on, it would be relevant to have that comparison. And in fact, we don't find anything interesting going on with those judgments, right? So everything I'm showing you is specific to the race judgments, which are the ones that we think play a role in the study. Okay, so here's what this looks like. So for the bias attribution question, we're basically asking, does the participant recognize bias? Where all I mean by bias here is like a directional influence on their belief, so that kind of like their moral judgment. So they previously indicated as part of that moral judgment the extent to which they agreed that it's disrespectful to use information about a person's race or ethnicity to form beliefs about their tipping habits, right? So we know for this participant what they said, and then we pipe it back to them, right? So for example, if a given participant said that oh, sorry. As I said, I see something different here than what you see there. Okay, so if a participant indicated that they slightly agree on that previous question, we give that back to them. We say, you previously indicated that you slightly agree that it's disrespectful to use information about a person's race, ethnicity to form beliefs about their tipping habits. How much did this influence how you personally evaluated the study? All right, so we're just asking them, like, did this have an effect on how you reasoned? Standard story from the objectivity illusion and naive realism and all of that literature would be that people would not say that this played a role in their belief formation. Then we take whatever answer they give us here. So for example, let's say they indicate a 5. Now we say, you just reported that thinking it's disrespectful or not to use information about race ethnicity influenced you 5 on a scale from 1 to 7. Do you think that this influenced you the right amount, too much, or not enough? Right. So now we're asking them whether or not they endorse the role that this played in their reasoning. So, did this play a role in your reasoning? And do you endorse the role that it played? Okay, that's what we're trying to get at here. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. Okay, data. Okay, so here are participants' ratings for whether or not these concerns about whether it was disrespectful played a role in their own reasoning. Down here, they're basically saying didn't play a role. Here they're saying it did play a role. And what you can see is that only in the condition where there was a racial difference reported and where they received the results so that they know that racial difference was found, do we see an elevation in the extent to which people are saying that they actually were influenced by this consideration. Right. So what this suggests is that people are actually right to some extent. They're recognizing that this played a role in their reasoning because they're only reporting it in the conditions where we think it actually played a role in their reasoning. And part of my reasoning to the previous question about why isn't this kind of symmetrical, it's that these are basically right at the midpoint, right? So for the other cases, it seems like people are not showing a reverse kind of effect. Okay. Then we ask people, do you think your reasoning was ideal, right? Because you could imagine a situation where people say, yeah, I really was influenced by that, but it was a mistake. I couldn't help it, and that's not what's going on. So perhaps this part's less surprising. Everyone thinks they reasoned in an ideal way. However people reason, they're just like the modal response is like, I was influenced just the right amount by these kinds of considerations. But the interesting thing is that they're reporting being more influenced, but not reporting a difference in the extent to which they think they were influenced appropriately, right? So we take this as evidence that people recognize that this is actually playing a role in the way they evaluate this factual conclusion from the study, right? And they take themselves to have been reasoning as they ought to have been. Yes.
But they're saying they're too biased.
These are like hovering around the midpoint. The modal response everywhere is actually 0, right? It's just that if we had the distribution that's like everyone's at 0 and then a few people are slightly higher, and there's no difference across the board. And then we were worried about this extra thing, like even though statistically there's nothing going on here, we were like, but that one's higher, And so we've done extra things like, well, can you explain, like, is this difference actually reliably bigger than that difference? And yes, it is. And we've replicated it 2 more times, maybe 3 more times. I think 2 more times with related materials and 1 time in a totally different domain. Yeah. Okay. So I take this to be evidence that individuals, at least in these cases, recognize and endorse the role of moral reasons in their own belief formation. And I think this challenges the sort of standard picture that we get where even though people are in fact being influenced by all sorts of things, that they are totally naive in the role of these influences and would in fact reject them, right? At least some of the time, it looks like people recognize these other things as legitimate influences on belief. They recognize that they're playing a role and they think they ought to be playing a role. I should say too that I'm saying this in more general terms. There's definitely individual variation here, right? So what we're finding is that some people do this some of the time, right? And we don't yet know the extent to which that's consistent across contexts and types of moral considerations and so on. All right, so zooming back out, I started out with these sort of 3 different families of kind of ethics of belief that might correspond to the way that people regulate and evaluate their own beliefs. And I think these kinds of findings suggest that at least for many people, one of these 2 might be the right view. And I don't think we can conclusively say which. I think we have some evidence that's consistent with each of these, and it could be that both of them simultaneously play a role. And I see the primary novel contribution of this work as telling us about the conscious part, the sort of metacognitive part of this story about how people evaluate and regulate their own beliefs, right? We already knew from decades of research that all of these sorts of things, in fact, do influence people's beliefs. And I think the new thing here is recognizing that there might be not just a role in recognizing it, but perhaps part of the mechanism that enforces these kinds of considerations in belief is that people think they ought to be reasoning this way, at least for some cases. So rather than ending with stronger conclusions, I thought I would end with some of the questions I'm asking myself about these data and that I'd like to think about with all of you. So one of them is whether or not these kinds of beliefs that are based on these non-evidential kinds of considerations are really the same sorts of beliefs as the ones that are based on evidence, right? So one story that I find appealing, which is not the one I argued for primarily today, is that maybe we really have different flavors of belief. And part of what we're seeing here is that there's a non-evidentialist flavor that has a slightly different profile. So I think that's an interesting idea to think about in the context of these data and other data. I think another really important question is what drives individual variation in something like individuals' folk ethic of belief and what the role of culture is in that. I think there's already some evidence in our data, but also from other labs to suggest that this is an area where we expect to see considerable individual variation, right? So there's some existing scales like actively open-minded thinking and so on, importance of rationality, that probably tracks something like the extent to which people do or don't endorse evidentialist kinds of considerations. And I think it's interesting to think about the sources of those and also the malleability of those. Right? What is it that makes people, pushes people around in terms of the extent to which they think that these kinds of considerations ought to influence belief? And what are the consequences for belief formation and revision? So for example, if somebody were to change their view, they were to become sort of more evidentialist or to embrace moral encroachment or something like that, what kinds of downstream consequences would that have for what they actually believe? And finally, what are the normative implications of this, if any, for normative epistemology, right? So I've borrowed lots of ideas here that are coming out of contemporary debates in normative epistemology. I think a lot of those debates are genuinely unresolved. I think there's a lot of open questions. And so I think there's an interesting question about whether these kinds of data bear on those debates at all, and if so, how. And I will end there. Thanks to my collaborators. Thanks for your attention.